And welcome. It's Monday. It's 1 o'clock. And if you hear a little huskiness in my voice, it's because I'm getting over a little cold thing that's going around. Be careful. If you get it, stay down. Thankfully, I feel better than I sound, and we'll do our best here to stay live with you as long as possible. And I guess I mean that literally, don't I? Anyway, right now we're getting a lot of issues, a lot of concerns about water in basements. Now, I've mentioned this before, but I think it's worth mentioning again because probably half a dozen issues arose this past week about water in basements. And the assumption is very often that the sellers failed to disclose a problem that was an ongoing problem that they were aware about, and that they failed to disclose that there was a basement water problem, a leak coming from, somewhere. And we're going to see more of this. And the reason is, as you've seen on the news, the lake levels, river levels, and water table levels are all historically high. A lot of the homes that have been built and that are experiencing these problems were built since 1985, when we had the last lake levels that even resembled this. So over the course of the last 30 years, we've seen lake levels lower, and now they've risen. And with that comes water tables, erosion. You've seen, if you've been out to the beaches are smaller, they're shorter, because the lake levels are taking up the beach simply from the height of them, but also because of erosion. $1-million homes are seeing large chunks of their property at the lake being lost to erosion. So when you get a complaint that there's a water problem, that your buyer moved in and now has a flood in their basement, be careful to assume that the seller misrepresented the property. It's possible that happened. It's certainly worthy of consideration, but also recognize that we need to be more diligent as buyer representatives to look for possibilities or look for evidence of prior water damage. If you go into a house and show a house and the carpeting has been pulled up in the basement, that should be a red flag. If the carpeting has been pulled up and you see some dark shadowing on the carpet tacks that hold the carpeting down, if you see shadowing or mildew on that or on the trim boards or on the drywall, spots of mildew, all of those things should be red flags. If the basement has been totally repainted recently, it might be worthy of taking the inspections to a higher level, actually having a humidity test done on the wall, on the drywall, to make sure that there's no absorption or wicking of water that was in the basement at one point up into the drywall or into the trim work. So be very conscious that we are going to see more complaints about water, more confusion, because sellers will say, I've never had a problem, and they might be telling the truth. This geological event is one that we can't control, and may be simply a matter of high water table and high lake and river levels that is causing these problems with water and basements. So we'll start there. This document, I wanted to see if I could cover it, and I don't know how much of I can cover it, but it's really a great document. Greg Carlson put this on a few years ago, and it's called a Pre-offer Addendum. Now, the reason that it's was done is that we were finding a lot of agents weren't exercising due diligence in informing their buyers or sellers about all of the options that they had available to them. For example, a fireplace inspection in addition to the normal inspections that are listed or were listed at one point. There used to be plumbing, heating, structural, and electrical, and those were the 4 inspections. And then people started saying, well, I want to inspect for radon, and they should. A lot of agents still in Grand Rapids say that we don't have a radon problem. And I've said for many, many years that we don't have a radon problem in Grand Rapids because we don't test for radon. The fact of the matter is we have just as many incidents of high radon levels as virtually every other country in the nation. Some of them we know have very high levels of radon in the 20s up into the 30s. So, and as you probably know, the EPA guideline for top radon levels is 4.0 picocuries per liter. So if you're bringing in a radon test, there are a lot of issues that you need to consider. One is the weather itself. If the ground is frozen in the thaw line, the radon may try to sneak in through the sump pump or in the cracks in the basement. It's going to find its path of least resistance to get into a house. Heavy, soggy clay is going to prevent radon from moving up through the ground as it normally would up into the atmosphere. Radon is a naturally occurring gas. It is a carcinogen, and it is the byproduct of the breakdown in uranium. So it is the second leading cause of lung cancer, and it's always worthy to test for it. The point is that a lot of agents started to test for radon, then they started to test pools, have a full-blown test of pools in the equipment, a fireplace, mold, all kinds of specialized inspections during their 10-day inspection window. And they're entitled to have those. In fact, I would encourage any buyer of mine who had any concerns about those issues to have it tested. Even if the tests run between $500 and $1,000, this is the biggest investment that most people make in a lifetime, and it's certainly worth avoiding a $20,000 or $30,000 or $40,000 repair to find out that something's not right prior to you closing on a property. So, again, Greg wrote this a few years ago, and we put it on .loop. It's been there for a while. We decided that there were a couple of things we wanted to do with it, which is, one, make it a fillable form on .loop, which we are in the process of doing if we haven't done already. If Cindy Wallace, if we have a link to it or can provide this as a PDF on 5 Star Connect, that would be great. But I'm going to read through a few of the things, and you might find it handy, because when you're sitting with a buyer and even a seller, it's great to review these things and say, here are some of the things that we're going to watch out for in the process of this transaction. For example, financing related contingencies. And the first one says, upon the execution of a purchase agreement, the buyer will immediately provide 5-Star an earnest money deposit made out to 5-Star Real Estate in the amount of some amount, unless the purchase agreement states otherwise. The agent will immediately deliver the check to 5-Star to be deposited by the broker. The broker will deposit the check within 2 banking days or within the number of banking days stated on the purchase agreement. Now, I know that some of you are going to say the West Michigan Purchase Agreement now allows as its standard language that the buyer has 72 hours from the time an offer is fully executed to deliver that earnest deposit check to the buyer's agent, the buyer's agent's broker. And that broker has 2 days in which to deposit the earnest deposit check. And that's very true. But we're using this in all markets. So if that doesn't apply to your market, then you may still be in a situation where you have to collect that earnest deposit at the time of the time you write the offer and deliver it to 5-Star, regardless of whether or not you have a fully executed purchase agreement. And once you have a fully executed purchase agreement, then 5-Star will have 2 business days in which to deposit the funds. Agents under the Michigan Occupational Code cannot hang on to an earnest deposit. It is required that we turn it over. Concessions. The buyer requests, let's say, 3% of the sales price or a specific amount, let's say $5,000, paid by the seller to be credited to buyer toward buyer's lending costs and any prepaid fees necessary to close the transaction. And I forgot to turn off my ringers, so just stay with me there a minute. There we go. Okay. It's live TV, you know? Okay, so that concession's pretty normal. We see that a lot. And so buyers and sellers should be made aware that it's possible that they may see that, or they may need to put that in their offer if they need funds to close. Buyers agree to apply for a mortgage within a certain number of days of an accepted agreement. The buyer further agrees to make all efforts for full lending approval and will do nothing to impair their ability to gain full approval. Failure to meet these requirements may be a breach of contract, and the earnest deposit money could be forfeited. I'll tell you a story. One of my stories. Sold a house. 3 days before the closing, the lender called me and said, the deal's dead. I can't. I'm sending you a denial of the mortgage. And I went, what? What do you? These were golden buyers. What are you talking about? And he said, well, they were golden buyers until they went out and bought $6,000 worth of couches from Art Van, and it's all on their credit card. And now their ratios don't match, their ratios don't work, and we have to kill the deal. Let me ask you a question. Do you think they got their earnest deposit back? No, they didn't. And the reason is that they essentially undermined their own ability to get the mortgage approved. When your buyer enters into a contract to buy a home, I urge you to explain to them over and over, as loudly as you can, that they shouldn't go out and buy a new truck or a new set of matching jet skis or motorcycles. Don't buy anything unless it's absolutely necessary. And even then, try to avoid it, because ultimately it could throw your ratios out of whack and the mortgage could be denied, or the lender may see it as essentially irresponsible behavior and deny your mortgage because you went out and spent a bunch of money while you were in the process of buying a house. There are those situations where a buyer's vehicle dies and they have to go out and buy something. But be very, very conservative in your spending if that circumstance happens. Moving on. Property-related contingencies. The buyers have been advised by their agent to have as many inspections as possible. Radon, fireplace, swimming pool, mold, anything you need. Purchase agreement shall be contingent upon the buyer's acceptance of the inspection findings. 5-Star especially recommends inspections to determine if there is or has been water penetration in basement or any attic areas. Choice of inspector is buyer's decision, and buyer acknowledges that 5-Star has not made any recommendation, verbal or written, regarding the inspector. 5-Star and its agents have made no statements, again verbal or written, regarding roofing, water in the basement, or grading issues. The parties agree that the broker and salesperson shall not be liable for errors and omissions made by any inspectors, repairmen, or other professionals. That's a really important, lot of stuff in here that's really important. Don't recommend an inspector to your buyer or even to your seller. Some agents will have a list. They will say, here are 10 or 5 or 8 inspectors. I've worked with all of them. Pick one and give them a call. Bye-bye. And that's probably the best way to do it. Stay away from saying, this is my inspector. That's the worst possible words. This is my inspector, because then you become party to the inspection. And of course you bring 5-Star along with you. When you become party to the inspections, 5-Star is also now on the hook if anything goes wrong. So don't recommend inspectors, and it's always good to have it actually signed from the seller or from the buyer that you didn't give them any recommendations about the property, about the inspector, about whether there's water in the basement or not. That's a really powerful paragraph. Moving on. Buyers have been advised to obtain a boundary survey, and the purchase agreement shall be subject to the buyer's review and approval prior to some date. Buyer acknowledges that a boundary survey is the only option which may be considered a survey. Neither 5-Star nor its agent has made any statements, verbal or written, regarding survey issues, property boundary issues, easements, shared or deeded right-of-ways. Buyer chooses to A, decline this advice, B, accept an existing or mortgage sketch, or C, include a boundary survey in the purchase agreement and make the purchase agreement to the buyer's review and approval of the boundary survey. Now, if you choose the last one, then you have to make sure that it's written into the purchase agreement, that you have to specify that the buyer wants to have a boundary survey, and then you can indicate who's going to pay for it, whether you're going to ask the seller to pay for it or for the buyer to pay for it. Keep another thing in mind. As it says, boundary surveys are the only surveys. Mortgage sketches are not surveys. Existing boundary surveys from 10 years ago may or may not be accurate. There may have been a building built or a fence built or a sidewalk or driveway rebuilt during those 10 years. So a recent, current, accurate boundary survey is really the best protection that a buyer has, that they know what they're buying and where the boundaries are. When you're dealing with rural property, particularly agriculturally zoned property, you may discover that those boundary surveys are going to cost a lot of money. Some of them into the thousands of dollars, several thousand. So if you're going to go down that road and you know that they want a boundary survey, I strongly recommend that you get an estimate of what it might be from a qualified civil engineer, and that you state on the purchase agreement that the buyer may reserve the right to waive the boundary survey if the cost exceeds, $1,000 or $2,000. When you're doing meets and bounds surveys, they can get very, very expensive. So be aware that you don't want to leave a blank check out there that requires somebody to pay out a lot more money than they were expecting. Buyer has chosen or declined Star Title to perform the property title search and closing services. Buyers have further agreed to review the title commitment given to them within the inspection period as stated in the purchase agreement, and may seek an attorney's advice if there are any concerns. Now, what we're primarily talking about here is getting the Schedule B to a buyer. The Schedule B is going to tell a buyer in the title work, is going to tell the buyer what needs to happen in order to get this deal closed. Was there at one point a quitclaim deed given from grandma to a grandson, but that was never recorded? If there's something like that, or if the death certificate of an estate or trust has not been recorded, the Schedule B in the title work is going to give the buyer a clear understanding of what has to happen before this can close with a clear title. The one we run into a lot is that on the Schedule B, it will indicate that there is an easement for, let's say, a shared driveway or a private road or utility easement, drainage easement, county drainage easement in the back. And the buyers are completely unaware that they can't build on the last 60 to 80 feet of their property because it's disallowed by a drainage easement, for example. They may also discover that there is a lease or an option to purchase or an option to lease a mineral rights. We find up in the area north of Muskegon that they're buying up a lot of mineral rights for fracking purposes. And some of those options are being exercised. Some of those areas are being mined right now by fracking companies. So when you run into the question, do you own the mineral rights? If the seller doesn't know, I would get in touch with a title company. I'd make sure I check out the Schedule B when I receive it and read it and understand it. And if you don't understand it, then contact the title company and make sure that you get a clear understanding of what has to happen in order to close the deal. If we simply allow that 10-day period in delivery to the buyer to occur without them reading it and understanding it, we run the risk that they will ignore it and then ultimately, by default, accept the property as is, and that may be a problem. Another item. Buyer has been advised by their agent about home warranties and have chosen to purchase one, request that the seller pay for one, or decline to have one negotiated within the purchase agreement. Again, whichever box you check, make sure that the purchase agreement reflects what the buyer wants. That if they want to purchase one themselves, you can indicate that in the purchase agreement. If they want the seller to pay for it, you can ask for it. If you feel that will, if your offer will still be competitive, or say, you know what, I'm not going to get one at all. Skip it. At least if we have this document signed, we have proof that we've made them aware that we provided this information to them as an option for them, and they chose to decline it. Okay, next one. Buyers have been advised by their agent to have a chattel agreement separate and apart from the purchase agreement, including but not limited to appliances and personal property to remain with home, and the consideration will be agreed upon by both parties. Buyers choose or decline to have a chattel agreement drafted. Now, in most cases, if we're talking about the kitchen appliances, stove, fridge, microwave, even sometimes a washer and dryer, mortgage companies will not have a problem with it being on the PA. Sometimes they do. And very often our agent's solution to that is to take them off the PA and put them on an addendum. Wrong. It doesn't go on an addendum, because what the mortgage company is telling you is put it on an addendum where I can't see it, so I can send the purchase agreement to the underwriter and get it approved. Unfortunately, that's mortgage fraud. It's not giving the full file, the full information to the underwriter. So don't put that on a PA. If you've been doing it, stop doing it. We have a chattel agreement, and a chattel agreement deals solely with personal property. Things like rakes and John Deere tractors and pool equipment and patio furniture and refrigerators and stoves and all of those things. And you can put all of that stuff on a chattel agreement and reach an agreement about it, whether it's to pay for it, that it is subject to, is contingent upon the close of the purchase agreement, but it is, all of these, this stuff is $1, that's the purchase price, or it may be thousands of dollars, depending on what the seller and buyer agree to. If they're buying a John Deere lawn tractor as part of a deal, a chattel agreement, they may be, there may be some real money changing hands. But personal property should be on a chattel agreement, except generally in the case of kitchen appliances can usually go on a purchase agreement. Possession-related contingencies. Oh boy. Wow. Buyers choose or decline to negotiate an escrow agreement with the sellers to establish a predetermined amount of money to protect the property in case of damage left by leaving debris, swapping out, taking appliances, and so on. we run into this one all the time. And again, if you review this with your buyer prior to writing the offer, they may say, you know what, I'm a little worried that we're giving them possession after close and they're going to be in there 15 or 30 days. I'm worried about the damage that they may cause. So I would like to put, $1,000, $2,000, $5,000 or more aside in escrow from the proceeds of the sale until we get possession to make sure that they have left the home in broom clean condition. We are running into more and more situations where sellers are moving out and leaving their trash for the buyer to deal with. So this is a very valid issue to cover with them. It can also cause your offer to not be accepted if you're in a competitive situation, but that's a discussion to have with your buyer in the moment when, before you write the offer. Two more real quick. Buyer has been advised to stipulate a large penalty fee in case the seller does not give possession as stated in the purchase agreement. It's called tenancy and sufferance. So on the purchase agreement, you may give a possession period. You may offer a possession period at zero or nominal cost to the seller to stay in the property for 10, 15, 30 days. But when you get to that point, then you say, okay, it's time to get out. Now we're going to charge you under the tenancy and sufferance clause. We're going to charge you $300 or $400 a day to stay there. Now you've got their attention. Now it's time for them to go, you know what? We need to move out and in a hurry. And finally, the hold harmless. Again, we get into a lot of situations, and it's really important that we attempt to get a hold harmless. Buyer hereby releases 5-Star Real Estate, its employees, agents, and principals from any and all liability arising out of any latent or undiscovered defects after the closing, and will hold them harmless from all loss, damage, and expenses, including attorney fees resulting from inspected or non-inspected material property facts. That's the pre-offer addendum. I encourage you, urge you, if you are working with buyers, that you take the time when you first meet with them. I do this when I first meet with clients in my office, buyers, when I ask them to come to the office and sit down before I start showing them homes. I go through this and I go through the purchase agreement to make sure that they understand the types of things that we're going to encounter along the way. I don't want them to be a surprise when we do encounter them. So I try to go through them beforehand. So, wow, I've actually talked for half an hour plus. And I thank you again for joining me. We'll see you here next week. Thanks again.